So I'll just introduce myself very quickly, and also my colleague Brian Martin. So my name is Richard Ford, and I'm the CTO for Integrity 360. I've been with Integrity for just over 11 years now. I've been working with all of our customers to understand their cybersecurity challenges, and then look at what we can do to help them and guide them, and also bring information from our other customers and from the industry to bear so they can make their decisions on their challenges and their cybersecurity strategy. And Brian is our Director of Product Management, should I say, and works very closely with me on developing the products and services that we bring to our customers. So looking at the portfolio of technology vendors, some of our sort of great partners are with us here today, but also looking at the services that we can bring to underpin those and to make sure that our customers are getting the very best out of that technology that they're implementing and utilizing in their environments. So today we're just going to talk about really our core topic that we are focused on for 2024, which, as we can see, is exposure, resilience, and the AI impact. So we're just going to do a little bit of an introduction into why we see that as important, and a few key takeaways, and Brian is also going to dive down into one of those key ones, being exposure, and how we should be looking at managing our exposure overall. So where I'd like to start first is just to really introduce the way that we at Integrity engage with our customers and the way that we view cybersecurity and the journey that we like to take our customers upon. So Security First is the name of our conference, but actually it comes from our security model that we operate around within Integrity 360, where really we focus on four key areas and really take that cyclical journey, so that constant 360-degree turn of cybersecurity, and we walk through each one of these steps to help our customers understand where they sit against this model, but also where their gaps are and where they can focus their attention upon. And we always start with this first element, which is the identify and assess. So we think it's extremely important to be able to, before you can plot your journey to where you're going, to understand where you are now and where you need to get to. And really that comes into identifying the threats, identifying the gaps you have in your environment, identifying what is critical to your business, and then really being able to assess where we're vulnerable to those so we can start saying, this is where we need to focus our spend and prioritize our activities. Once we understand our landscape and where we are operating in, we can then move on to the next stage, which is saying, now we know what we need to protect and what we need to prevent. So building our preventative and protective controls as strong as possible, whether that's through technology, people, process, or actually it needs to be a combination of all three of those. So we work with our customers to make sure that we are protecting and preventing what is important to them, to make sure that they don't end up in the headlines. But it's not always possible to have 100% guaranteed protection prevention, so we need to have a mature approach to say, well, actually, we're going to have to look for those instances of where we are not being able to prevent or protect ourselves fully, but then to say, well, we need to have a capability to detect and analyze those incidents. Are they true incidents? Are they false positives? And actually, what is the impact going to be so we can understand the actions we need to take to be able to remediate against those. Which then brings us around to the next stage. Do we have the capability in place to be able to respond and recover to those events, those incidents that we've detected, we've analyzed, and we understand the threat, or may have impacted our business or organization already, which is important. We'll come on to that a little bit later. And then, again, everything needs to feed back through into our lessons learned, into identify and assess, and we keep on that circle over and over again. So that's just a brief intro to how we engage with our customers at Integrity 360, and really forms the basis of everything we do. So just getting into the meat of why we're here, and probably start answering that question, why is our topic exposure, resilience, and the impact, the AI impact? Now, every year we sit down as a team, so myself, Brian, Nick, sit down with Jess in our marketing team and look at actually what is the core topic, what is important in the industry, what's important to customers, what is trending at the moment that we need to focus upon. Last year we spent our time looking at visibility, so reintroducing the concept of visibility to cover that gap as we've moved into the cloud, as we've moved to remote working, hybrid operations post-COVID, and fixing those gaps, plugging those gaps of visibility. And this year we said, well, actually, there's three core areas that we need to focus upon, and that's our exposure, making sure that we're resilient, and making sure that we are understanding the impact of AI, which we'll come on to very briefly later, just the two different sides of that. And there are many different sides to that. So starting with exposure, I guess firstly, what is exposure? Exposure is understanding not just how we're exposed as an organization, but what we're exposed to and how we're going to identify and defend it. And some of the challenges around exposure for us at the moment is around that continued and rapid cloud adoption and cloud growth. Most organizations that we're working with, that I'm working with, have gone through that process of lifting and shifting what they do now straight into the cloud, and are now moving into more of a cloud-native operation using containers and serverless workloads. And what we actually found is not only is that opening up a new area of exposure, which we're seeing a lot of in the press in terms of exposed S3 buckets, misconfigured identities and access management rules, but it's also doubling our efforts because we still have all of that legacy equipment still there. So it's actually not just adding, it's not just a new area, it's additional area of exposure. We've got shadow IT, very tied to that cloud adoption. Very, very easy for different business units to invest and stand up new SaaS applications. And that exposure there, we think about exposure quite often, and I'll come on to that in a second. We think about exposure quite often in terms of vulnerabilities, but actually what we want you to think about is actually, in this instance, it's not a vulnerability we need to be concerned about. It's the exposure of our data going into a third-party platform that we don't have any control over or even knowledge of, so shadow IT being a core challenge. As I said, there's lots of legacy platforms. So we have an excellent IR, so incident response team that work day in, day out, helping our customers when they have suffered an incident. And probably at least 50%, if not more, of those incidents are commonly triggered after the breach of a legacy platform that has been forgotten. So yes, we need to shift and look at these new exposures and these new platforms, but we just need to make sure that those legacy platforms are being maintained or retired or isolated if they're no longer in support, but still need to be maintained. And then lastly, that piece I touched upon was the growth in vulnerabilities. We have a very narrow view of vulnerabilities being CVEs, but I'm going to hand over to Brian in a second and really bring that to life in terms of actually our exposure needs to go a lot further than just a CVE and a vulnerability. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Brian.
Thank you, Rich, and buenos dias, everyone. Lovely to be here. So Rich talked about exposure being not just vulnerabilities. Obviously, vulnerabilities is a key part of exposure, but there are many other types of exposure that we need to consider in cybersecurity. So think about things like misconfigurations, identities and permissions, because obviously now with so many people working remotely, working from home, working from cafe or while they're traveling, the permissions around identities is a key security control to consider. Security controls, you may think that you have security controls in place. You may have endpoint protection, endpoint detection and response, but do you really know that that's actually working? That there isn't some memory problem on the device which is causing that functionality not to work? The use of SaaS is just increasing year on year. So a lot of exposures potentially around the misuse of SaaS applications. Even your people. I think when we think about exposure, we need to think about all of the aspects of your attack surface. And your people is a key part of that. So the training and awareness of your people is an exposure that also needs to be managed and optimized. Your physical security. So attackers will say that one of the easiest way to intrude on a network is actually through physical security, bypassing physical security controls, connecting to the network, and then they're in. And even our red teaming professional services, for example, often use this as a way to demonstrate the exposure within a client's organization. Supply chain. We're all familiar with the major supply chain breaches in recent years. So your supply chain and the vulnerability of your supply chain is a crucial exposure. Credentials, so whether it's leaked credentials on the open, deep and dark web, or whether it's cached credentials inside your organization that a threat actor who has gained initial access can sometimes leverage cached credentials to move laterally or escalate their permissions. And of course, AI represents a new type of exposure that also needs to be managed, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. So that's why we think that security leaders need to become CEOs. And obviously, you're sitting here going, do we really need to run the entire organization in order to manage our exposures? Well, that certainly would help. And definitely the leadership does have a strong responsibility to ensure cybersecurity. But also, you can think about it in the context of chief exposure officer. All of us people working in security, we have a responsibility to be the people who think most about exposure and when it's being introduced and when new exposures emerge within the organization. So it's good to adopt that kind of mindset of, I'm the chief exposure officer, where is there exposure, how should I mitigate that risk in my organization? Because the problem is that attackers don't just use one vulnerability or exposure and that's it. We all know that attackers, they chain their exposures to achieve their goals within their attack. So they might initially do some enumeration, they might leverage an external vulnerability, and then get their initial foothold established, conduct lateral movement, escalate privileges, and ultimately get to those critical assets that they're aiming to get towards to either compromise or extract data. And the MITRE ATT&CK framework, as we know, lists all these different tactics and techniques that attackers use. And really, they're using lots of different exposures, both externally and internally, in order to achieve those goals. So we need to be cognizant of that when we are actually thinking about how to manage our exposures. And it's not enough just to think about the external exposure. So the fact is that in order to understand exposure, you need to understand your attack surface, because exposure is those gaps in your attack surface. And most organizations don't actually have a sufficient understanding of that attack surface. So you need to understand that attack surface and the exposures and the potential role that those could play in an attack path. Also, new exposures emerge quite, can emerge quite rapidly in the blink of an eye due to a misconfiguration or a deployment of a new piece of infrastructure. And so therefore, it's not enough just to check your exposures once a year or very periodically. They need to be constantly monitored and detected. And understanding those attack paths helps you prioritize in terms of how can you choke off those attack paths so that you can limit the damage if someone does actually breach your environment. And why is this prioritization critical? Well, the problem is we're drowning in vulnerabilities, exposures to manage. So how do we prioritize? We need to prioritize the critical ones. So taking a common example, here we have the Titanic, and someone, the officers here are concerned about an exposure that somebody could trip on these deck chairs, so they're rearranging them. But there's a threat, which is the iceberg on the horizon. But what actually happened in the case of the Titanic was they made an assumption that those front compartments of the ship could not be breached to the extent where the ship would sink. However, due to the way the crash happened, 6 of the compartments were breached, and that meant that the walls inside the ship were not watertight, because it was assumed that the water would never get in there, and the water moved laterally throughout the ship, and the ship sank, tragically, with many people losing their lives. They also had a very poor incident response plan, where there wasn't enough lifeboat places, And even then, they only managed to fill 60% of the lifeboat places because they didn't have the right processes and common understanding of how to deal with the situation. So there's a lot of analogies here you can draw with cybersecurity around the real exposure was those internal exposures that caused ultimately the tragedy, plus that invalid assumption that there was really no need for proper incident response because that could never happen surely, but the reality was it did. And so we can draw the same parallel with cybersecurity. So in terms of exposure management, there are three main pillars. We need to make sure, obviously, we manage our vulnerabilities, we understand our assets, we understand what vulnerabilities they have, we understand the criticality of those assets, and we prioritize the remediation and the patching and implementation of the remediation controls. However, we also need to have a much wider understanding and manage the attack surface. So that's not just, it's every asset. It's not just the IT assets, it's the OT assets, it's the IoT assets, it's the looking at the attack paths within the environment. It's looking at the cloud security posture and configuration. It's looking at digital risks, so those external leakages of data or credentials that might be out there that could represent an exposure. It's your supply chain, it's your people. It's all of those aspects that I talked about in the previous slide. And then, of course, continuous testing. So whether that's continuous pen testing, breach and attack simulation, security controls testing, it's really important to constantly monitor those things. And that's why there's this new concept has emerged in recent years called continuous threat exposure management, where you look at the attacker's and the defender's view, and you put in place a program of continuously evaluating your exposures and helping to remediate them. So there's basically 5 steps to continuous threat exposure management. So you need to scope out what are your critical assets, your external attack surface, your internal assets and attack surface, your cloud security posture and your SaaS security posture. Discovery then, you'd go through discovery phase. You work on the prioritization based on that analysis that you've done. Then you validate those things to make sure they are true exposures and do have the severity that you think they have, and you mobilize a team to resolve them. And that's a continuous process. It's not something you do once, it's something that's ingrained in your security controls on an ongoing basis. So when you think about the maturity of threat exposure management, you can think about it in 3 dimensions. So what assets are you covering? So yes, in the foundational level, you need to be thinking about all of your IT assets, making sure those are covered. Then you move on to making sure you're covering definitely all of them, not just some of them, thinking about your people, thinking about cloud, thinking about mobile, IoT, and OT. Now, obviously, your type of business will dictate the relative priority of some of these asset coverages. So if you're heavy into manufacturing, for example, then you should think about potentially the OT being much higher up as a foundational element of your cybersecurity. But it's a model for thinking about how do I think about my exposure, what assets are in scope for that I need to manage. The second dimension is the exposure scope within that domain. So obviously vulnerabilities and misconfigurations will be foundational, but then you need to build on that as your maturity grows towards things like security awareness, privileged identities, and then in fact all the identities within your organization, cloud security, open, deep and dark web, supply chain, right up to brand abuse and VIP monitoring being kind of some of the more advanced controls that you would put in place in terms of the scope of the exposures that you're looking at. And then finally, on the management processes that you put around that, at a very basic level, you need to be doing vulnerability management, risk-based vulnerability management. But as you go up to maturity into the mature stage, you're looking at your phishing simulation, testing your human security, external attack surface management, your regular penetration testing, and then growing into attack path analysis, red teaming, and security awareness, right up to continuous controls and continuous threat exposure management. So the goal should be to move up the maturity curve on all these dimensions, and according to Gartner, organizations who implement this are 3 times less likely to suffer a breach. So that's, if you believe Gartner's view on it, it can significantly reduce your risk exposure. So I'll turn that over back to Rich now, to the next stage.
Thanks, Brian. So that's kind of exposure and plotting our course on those dimensions of how do we mature our approach to exposure and cover all the key areas. The next hot topic that we have is around resilience, which very closely linked into exposure, but we see as being critically important for organizations. So just starting with a quick definition of resilience, so the capacity to withstand difficulties, toughness, which we think is really important, but also the quality of being able to return quickly to a previously good condition, or a condition after problems. So we see those as 2 very key points that need to be built into any cybersecurity strategy, in any organizational strategy. And just get that to click on. So just diving a little bit further down into resilience, and time's up against us, so we'll just touch upon these 2 topics, but they'll be covered in some of the talks a little bit later on in a bit more detail. But resilience is really the cornerstone for the digital-first world, maintaining those operations in the face of adversity. And actually, you can see that regulations are being enforced very soon, covering these for critical national infrastructure within the EU, but also in financial systems. And actually, it's a wider impact than just finance houses, for example, in terms of their third-party suppliers also need to adhere to regulations like DORA. And really, they are enforcing that need for resilience in an organization and across a few different areas. And even if you're not if you're not covered by or not fall under these regulations, every organization should be going down this process and looking at how do we architect our environments to be resilient to attack, so making sure that we can defend ourselves adequately as the attacks come down. Obviously, it's critically important that we understand what those threats are so that we can build that resilience into our environments and into our security process. We also need to look at how we can minimize the impact of those attacks, and really that is that ability to be able to identify when those attacks are happening and have a very, very quick response. And then hand in hand with that, in terms of being able to have a very clear path to be able to respond and recover back to that known good state. So in terms, if we're looking here in terms of the activities that we should be looking at, is red team sort of testing, is what's being sort of pushed through the DORA process to look at, where, from an attacker's perspective, going through that process of using threat intelligence to understand, what are the techniques that are going to be used against you, testing those, validating, identifying those gaps, and then making sure that we can then mitigate those. But also making sure that we have that incident response capability and that we're prepared to use that incident response capability. As I talked about, our IR team are engaged in a lot of incident response engagements continuously at the moment. And there's a big difference between the organizations that pick up the phone out of the blue and say, we need some help, versus those organizations that have gone through that process, have done an incident response preparedness exercise, so everybody understands their roles, responsibilities, what they need to do, so when it does happen, they can respond and recover extremely quickly. And then the last piece really is around that AI impact that some of our talkers will touch upon today. And the 3 ways that we kind of look at it is, the difference between the hype, the hope, and what reality is. And I think that's going to be the balancing act for 2024 when it comes to AI, is not getting carried away with hype that the security industry is very, very keen to talk about. And then look at some of our hopes and dreams that AI could have delivered for us, and try and figure out where that reality is. And when we saw that peak hype, on the one side we've got the hype coming out that the attackers are going to be self-determining AI that's going to, that we're not going to be able to defend ourselves from, which, is, we hear a lot of talk in the industry, but that's, not really reality. Where's the real threat at the moment, for my money? It's deep fakes. So really it's educating people on how to understand when they're being targeted in advanced phishing attacks and advanced sort of deep fake incidents. So I think going forward, how do we authenticate somebody, even if we're looking at them over Teams or if we're testing their information, that's going to be one of our key concerns and challenges. There's also peak hype around the hope For us defenders, I think there's a lot of talk of, actually, most people are going to be able to put their feet up and relax at the beach. That's not really going to be the case, but it's how do we embed that AI into our organization successfully and securely and responsibly, in fact, actually. There's an entire ISO standard, ISO 41000, I think, or Eugenio will correct me if I've got the wrong number there, that focuses on how do we implement AI securely, successfully, and responsibly in our organization. So it's being able to figure that out in between. And hopefully, throughout this conference and throughout the year, we can help our customers get to that point. So just lastly on AI, I'll just hand back to Brian very briefly, just to talk about really AI in terms of exposure, threat or opportunity, Brian.
Oh, thank you. So I talked about applying the CEO mindset or the Chief Exposure Officer mindset in the environment. So AI is a good example of this. And I always think it's good to have in a presentation a good meme to think about. So I think you might have all seen this one before. So applying this to AI. So obviously AI is the new thing coming along that everyone is very attracted to. The business head is turned in terms of, think of all of the productivity and cost savings and whatnot. But as security leaders, we need to think about, okay, that there's definitely a lot of benefit here, but what are the exposures that we need to also consider? So we need to apply the chief exposure mindset to AI. And I think there's three main areas to think about. One is that AI does create new exposures because now there's a potential for unauthorized access. It makes it a lot easier to access data within your organization because it's available through a natural language interface, whether it's someone inside the organization who is accessing information they shouldn't, or potentially a compromised user account that is gaining access. So thinking about the impact of a breach if someone should gain access to that interface, it points to things like how you manage your information governance, your data classification and labeling, and ultimately the access permissions that people have to the different types of data via the AI. AI can also turbocharge exploitation of exposures. So we all know about deepfakes and social engineering. It gets a lot easier with the advent of AI. AI is starting to think about, how it can be used to automate attacks or do them at scale. But then also, on the defensive side, there are some positives, which is AI-powered security enhancement. So much better exposure visibility that you can now query and find out where my exposures are, understand incidents a lot quicker, to be able to understand in your own natural language what's actually going on and how those could and should be remediated.
Brilliant, and then we'll just wrap up, and we won't take too much more of your time. So really just going back to that security-first model and how does that apply? Well, exposures really are how do we identify and deal with those exposures as much as possible. Building that resilience in across those three, sort of protect and prevent, those detect and analyze, and then respond and recover. And then our goal will be how do we wrap and manage that AI impact across that entire security model going forward. So just some key takeaways here from our talk, and then we can let you enjoy the rest of the conference there. So, expand that concept of exposure well beyond vulnerabilities and think of that entire attack surface. Make sure we're looking at those attack paths. So, it's not just that critical vulnerability that's hidden away or that minor vulnerability that's hidden away deep in our environment. It's actually what is the chain of vulnerabilities that an attacker can use to move through those. So focus on that in terms of exposure. And then make sure you initiate that process of continuous threat and exposure management so that we're understanding from an attacker's point of view and validating and making sure that we're focused on the right assets. And really that's your step to becoming that CEO, that Chief Exposure Officer that Brian talked us through. As I said, resilience is the cornerstone of the digital-first world, so we need to make sure we're building resilience into our IT and into our entire organization. That should be coming right from the very top. And then lastly, and focus on how we can respond and recover to attacks. And then lastly, don't get caught up in the AI hype. Let's look at what's the difference between the reality, the hype and versus reality, and actually how we can make use of it, but also taking those steps to responsible use of it so that we're not exposing our data or our users by accident. So that's very much, enjoy the rest of the conference. That's it from us. Thank you very much from myself and Brian.
Thank you very much.